I had been in London for no more than a week when the letter arrived from my old friend Hercule Poirot. As usual, it was brief, but I could read between the lines. "I find myself engaged in a case of some unusual nature," he wrote. "It requires a mind of precision. Perhaps you might accompany me?" Knowing my inclination toward his investigations, I had agreed without hesitation, and so it was that we found ourselves heading to the countryside, to the quiet town of Belhurst, where a celebrated actor had just met his untimely end. The name Julian Darcy had been famous among theatre circles for years, a man whose performances graced the stage with the kind of charm and gravitas one rarely found outside the walls of the London theatres. To say that he had been adored would be an understatement. He was the kind of actor who made audiences forget their troubles, their doubts, and sometimes even the passage of time itself. His final performance, a swan song of sorts, had taken place the night before. The evening had ended on a high note, or so the crowd believed. When we arrived at the old theatre, I could see why it had earned such a reputation. Its grand exterior boasted ivy-covered walls, large arched windows, and a faded gold sign that read, "The Belhurst Theatre." Inside, the scent of wood and aged velvet clung to the air, and I found myself momentarily taken in by its nostalgic beauty. But there was little time for sentiment. The body of Julian Darcy had been discovered in his dressing room, and a sense of foreboding had already set in. The stage manager, Miss Sylvia Brooks, was the first to greet us. "I'm glad you've come, Monsieur Poirot," she said in a clipped voice, her demeanour stiff with the kind of resolve I had come to expect from those used to the pressures of the stage. "We didn't know where else to turn. It seemed such an awful thing to happen after what should have been a celebratory evening." Poirot gave her a polite nod, but made no comment on the tragedy. He was already studying her with that characteristic look, eyes narrowing, not in suspicion, but in the manner of a man deciphering a puzzle. "We shall see what can be done, mademoiselle," he replied, his tone cool and methodical. "Lead me to the scene of the crime." The dressing room was, as expected, a small, dimly lit space filled with mirrors, costumes, and scattered props from the evening's performance. The body of Julian Darcy lay stretched out on the floor, draped across his costume, as though he had been preparing to take a bow, but had never risen again. A glass of brandy was placed carefully on a nearby table. Half full, its contents a rich amber colour. The actor's face, though pale, bore no signs of violent struggle, and his posture suggested a deliberate arrangement, as though someone had gone to great lengths to make it appear almost like the final act of a theatrical performance. Poirot studied the scene for a moment, standing still, his hands folded in front of him. I had learned long ago that when Poirot was silent, it was never by accident. He was gathering his thoughts as sharp as ever. "It is odd," I said, breaking the silence. "Isn't it, Poirot, the way he is positioned, almost as though someone wanted it to look like an accident, or perhaps a suicide?" Poirot nodded, his lips pursed. "I am not so certain, mon ami," he said softly. "I do not believe this is a case of a man taking his own life, though that is the assumption, n'est-ce pas?" He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No, no. This is something more intricate." I peered at the glass of brandy and the positioning of the body. There was no blood, no visible signs of injury. Still, something was off. I could sense the tension in the air, the unease that had gripped the room long before our arrival. The mystery deepened. At that moment, Miss Sylvia Brooks, looking uncomfortable, spoke again. "It's as though he fell asleep, Mr. Darcy. He had been drinking after the performance. The audience had adored him. They were calling for an encore. It was his last performance. Everything seemed so perfect." Poirot turned to face her with a thoughtful expression. "And yet, mademoiselle, the body is positioned as though for a final bow, a theatrical gesture, one might say. And the glass, which remains half full, if he was indeed drinking, why was he not more relaxed?" Poirot's gaze flickered briefly toward the glass. "Is this a man who died in his sleep, or was it made to appear so? Something about this tells me that Mr. Darcy was the victim of a clever hand." I glanced at the body again, my eyes moving slowly over the details. The glass seemed too precise, too deliberate in its placement. It was the kind of detail that Poirot would call a clue. one of the little grey cells he so often referred to. The half-filled glass, the perfect positioning, the lack of disorder, it all spoke of a careful mind at work, someone who wanted the scene to be set just so. A clever hand indeed, I murmured, uncertain of where Poirot's thoughts had already taken him. We shall see, Poirot said, his voice smooth but with a subtle edge. The initial signs point to a death that is less natural than the stage might suggest, but let us not be too hasty. His eyes glinted with the kind of quiet confidence that always preceded one of his brilliant deductions. It would be foolish to make assumptions just yet. We must wait and see. With a final glance at the body, Poirot straightened and turned toward the stage manager. Tell me, mademoiselle, what of the others who were with Monsieur Darcy last night? The actors, the crew? Miss Brooks shifted uncomfortably. They're all waiting in the common room, Monsieur Poirot. They're shocked, of course. They've all been questioned by the constable already. And what did the constable have to say about this death? Poirot asked, his voice never rising above its usual calm. The constable is baffled. He hasn't found any evidence to suggest foul play, though he's agreed to keep the theatre closed for the time being. He seemed to think it was just a tragic accident. Her voice wavered slightly at the last word. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A tragic accident? Perhaps, but something about this scene suggests otherwise. I will speak with the constable myself, and we shall see what the others have to say. As Miss Brooks led us from the room, my thoughts were consumed with the oddity of the scene we had just witnessed. No signs of struggle, no blood, no immediate clue to suggest a struggle or violence. Yet something about the positioning of the body, the half-empty glass of brandy, nagged at me. It felt staged, as though someone had carefully orchestrated every detail. A death made to look like the perfect final act of a fading star. But why? The answer, I knew, was waiting to be uncovered. The game, as Poirot would say, was afoot. As we walked toward the common room, I felt a lingering sense of unease. Who had benefited from this death? Who had the motive and, more importantly, who had the skill to make it look so perfect? It was only a matter of time before Poirot's little grey cells unravelled the truth. But for now, the mystery hung, in the air as heavy as the dust motes in the old theatre, waiting to be seen. The theatre was quiet when Poirot and I entered the common room, an uneasy stillness hanging over the room like a dense fog. The actors and crew were gathered in clusters, murmuring in low voices, their faces still etched with shock. Some were standing in small huddles, while others sat, their posture stiff and unnatural, as though they were caught between a sense of disbelief and the dawning reality of the loss. Despite the consternation of the moment, the tension was palpable. It was clear that something more than mere grief was at play. Poirot moved through the room with his usual quiet assurance, his sharp eyes scanning the scene with the precision of a watchmaker, examining the inner workings of a delicate timepiece. As always, he remained silent, his small but purposeful steps taking him from one group to another, as though drawing an invisible map of the relationships and tensions within the room. His presence was magnetic. Those who noticed him often stiffened or turned their gaze away, but none of them dared approach until he spoke. I observed this with some fascination, as Poirot seemed to sense things long before anyone else had an inkling. He had always been gifted at reading a room, picking up on subtleties in speech, gesture, or even mere silence, and in this case his mind was already working, absorbing the nuances of the situation. There was Lena Vernon, the leading lady of the troupe, standing apart from the others. She was a striking woman, still in the midst of her stage makeup, her costume clinging to her slender frame, as though she hadn't yet fully shed the persona of her character. Her face was pale, but her expression was remarkably composed, even serene. There was no sign of distress in her demeanor, not a tear, not a tremble. In fact, her gaze was steady and far too calculating for someone who had just lost a colleague, let alone a man she had shared a stage with for so many years. I found this unnerving. It seemed wrong. But I knew better than to make rash judgments. Poirot's presence had a way of forcing all one's assumptions into sharper focus. As we moved closer, I could see Lena's lips pressed together in something that almost resembled a smile. Not a smile of joy, but one of control. It made me uneasy. for there was something so unsettlingly ungrieved about her demeanor. She wasn't simply holding herself together. It was as though she was in control of her emotions to the point of suppression. To any observer, it was a performance of its own. Poirot did not approach her immediately, though his gaze lingered for a moment longer than was perhaps polite. Instead, he turned his attention to the director, Arthur West, who was pacing back and forth near the stage. Dorte, his brow was furrowed, his hands constantly running through his hair as though he could not decide which problem to address first. The man was a picture of nerves, and yet his anxious energy seemed somehow forced. It was as if he was trying too. Hard to appear concerned and busy, though his movements seemed aimless, more for show than genuine action. Poirot tilted his head, as though reading a page from a book that I couldn't see. He looked up at me with a slight smile, but the expression didn't reach his eyes, which were still focused on West. "I do not like the look of him, mon ami," Poirot murmured softly, so that only I could hear. "West, he is not the grieving man he wishes to appear." I followed Poirot's gaze, watching the director from a distance. His movements were jerky, his lips chewing nervously at the edge of his mustache. The way he hovered near the door, always a step away from truly engaging with the others, suggested a man who was not fully present. It was as though he was eager to leave the room, to escape the scene of the tragedy, rather than fully process it. "You see, Hastings," Poirot continued, "when a man has his reputation as his dearest treasure, he does not want to lose it. And Arthur West? He is a man who fears losing his. His behavior tells me this. He is pretending to be distraught, but his mind is already elsewhere, calculating." I nodded slowly, though I wasn't yet sure what Poirot was getting at. I had to admit, I had already begun to feel the weight of the tension between the people in the room, but Poirot's deductions always seemed to be drawn from some deeper well of perception. Poirot approached West, and the director looked up sharply, as though startled from some inner thought. He quickly wiped his hands on his trousers and stood straighter, clearly attempting to regain composure. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," West said, his voice almost too loud. "I'm glad to see you. This is a most terrible situation, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate your expertise. It is, of course, an accident, but I'm sure you'll understand I must ensure that the business side of things continues as normal. We can't have the press getting wind of this and turning it into a scandal." Poirot's eyes twinkled ever so slightly. "A scandal, Monsieur West? You fear this tragedy becoming a scandal?" West's eyes shifted briefly, a subtle tension in his jaw. He coughed lightly, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly as he rubbed them together. "Of course, as much as it's a personal tragedy, there's the theatre to think about. We must move forward, for the sake of the troupe, for the sake of the show." Poirot's gaze didn't falter, and neither did his calm demeanor. "You believe, then, that Mr. Darcy's death was an unfortunate accident, yes?" he asked, his voice as measured as ever. "Yes, absolutely," West replied quickly, his voice now straining under the weight of his own assurances. "No doubt about it. No foul play here." His words were hurried, and for a brief moment, there was something in his eyes, something guarded, almost as though he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Poirot's smile never wavered. "I see. But I believe, monsieur, that you are in some haste to dismiss the idea of foul play. I wonder why this is." West swallowed, but before he could respond, Lena Vernon stepped forward from her solitary spot by the mirror. Her presence seemed to pull the energy in the room toward her, like the calm before a storm. "Arthur," she said, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable authority, "you mustn't think so loudly, dear. You're only adding to the confusion." She turned toward Poirot then, her gaze meeting his with an unsettling calm. "I'm sure you have questions, Monsieur Poirot, but please, I implore you, this is not a matter for the stage." Poirot regarded her for a moment, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. "Ah, Mademoiselle Vernon, I wonder, is it not always a matter of the stage, the lines we perform on it, and those we perform off it as well?" Lena's eyes did not flicker, but there was a slight tension in her posture, just a fraction too stiff to seem entirely natural. Poirot's observations were not lost on me. There was something beneath her poised exterior, something beneath the stillness of her expression. It was as though she was playing a role, just as she did on stage, but in a different play, one with no script. As we stood in the room, I couldn't help but feel that the mystery was only just beginning to unfold. The connections between these people, between Lena, Arthur, and the others, were delicate, fraught with hidden motives and unspoken truths. And yet, Poirot's calm, deliberate presence only made the atmosphere thicker, as though every word, every glance carried weight. Something told me that the answer would not be found in the obvious clues. The game was afoot, and Poirot was already several steps ahead, weaving together a web of suspicion and intrigue, and with that, he turned to me, his gaze meeting mine, as though to confirm his next move. "Hastings, my friend," he said softly, "it is time to ask the questions that others do not dare to. Come, let us begin." The next morning, Poirot wasted no time in beginning his inquiries. We arrived at the theatre early, the atmosphere still heavy with the lingering shock of Julian Darcy's death. The morning light, so often a source of comfort, seemed cold today, filtering weakly through the stage curtains and casting long shadows across the once vibrant sets. There was no use in delaying further. Each person involved, whether directly or indirectly, had a part to play in this performance, and Poirot was intent on discovering what it was. Our first stop was the dressing room of Lena Vernon, the celebrated leading lady of the company. I had already observed her unusual composure, and it seemed prudent to begin there. When we entered, she was seated, gazing absent-mindedly at her reflection in the mirror, the same detached expression still haunting her features. Her costume, still adorned with the glittering remnants of her stage persona, clung to her figure, like a second skin. Her lips parted as we entered, and she straightened herself, though not with the urgency one might expect from someone in mourning. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in her soft, measured voice, "I trust you're not about to suggest that poor Julian's death wasn't the unfortunate result of natural causes." Poirot's gaze never wavered from her face as he replied, "Mademoiselle Vernon, it is my habit to observe carefully and not to jump to conclusions without a thorough understanding of the facts. I ask only that you assist me in this matter." Her lips twitched at the corners, but the smile that briefly appeared on her face never quite reached her eyes. "Of course, I shall do whatever I can. We all want this to be over." That phrase, "we all want this to be over," struck me as odd, but I said nothing, for I trusted Poirot to see what I could not. Poirot's keen eyes were already scanning the room, taking in every detail. He observed the half-packed suitcase in the corner, the faint scent of perfume in the air, and the slight tremor in Lena's hands as she folded a piece of fabric. But it was her words that drew his attention most. "Mademoiselle, you say it was natural causes, yet you also mentioned yesterday that Mr. Darcy had been acting strangely in the days leading up to his death. This is unusual, no? A man acting strangely and then, suddenly, dying." Lena hesitated for the briefest of moments, but I caught it, the slight falter in her otherwise steady demeanor. It's true, he had been distracted. He seemed off. But that's hardly unusual for an actor, is it? The pressures of the stage can do that to a person. And Julian was no different. Poirot leaned forward, his tone calm but probing. "What was it exactly that you noticed in him, mademoiselle? You speak of acting strangely, but what precisely do you mean?" Lena's eyes flickered for just a moment before she composed herself again. "He was distracted," she said again, though with less conviction this time. "He was losing focus, forgetting lines, arriving late to rehearsals. It's not uncommon in our profession, Monsieur Poirot. You must know that." "I do," Poirot said gently, "but you speak as though it were nothing. And yet, you cannot deny that his behavior must have caused you concern. A partner on stage cannot afford to lose focus so readily. And yet there was no urgency in your manner when you spoke of it." She looked at him coolly. "You'll forgive me, Monsieur Poirot, but I see no reason to dwell on something so minor. He was an actor, and his mind was always elsewhere. It's hardly surprising that it would affect his performance. He was emotional, perhaps. It's a tragic accident, that is all." Poirot nodded, though I could tell he wasn't convinced. Neither was I. There was something in the way Lena dismissed her own words that seemed far from natural. She had claimed to notice his disarray, yet her voice, her demeanor, suggested it meant little to her. I could not help but wonder if there was more to it. Was it truly just the unpredictability of an actor's life, or was there something more beneath the surface of her words? Our next interview took us to Arthur West, the director, who had remained conspicuously absent from the dressing room during our earlier visit. He was found in his office, standing at a large desk cluttered with papers, as though he was trying to immerse himself in his work to escape the reality of the tragedy. West greeted us with a forced smile, the kind of smile a man puts on when he knows his facade is already starting to crack. "Monsieur Poirot, I was hoping you'd be along shortly. I've been meaning to speak to you about what happened." Poirot inclined his head slightly, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Indeed. Monsieur West, I believe you have a great deal to explain. You see, I find it odd that a director whose main responsibility it is to ensure the smooth running of his company would be so quick to dismiss any possibility of foul play in the death of one of his leading actors." West's posture stiffened at once, and he glanced away from Poirot's sharp gaze, clearly unsettled. "I don't know what you're implying, Poirot. I've told you. It's an accident. Darcy was never the picture of health, and his lifestyle, well, it was hardly the kind that leads to long life. His sudden passing isn't that much of a surprise, given his habits." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Habits, you say? And tell me, Monsieur West, what exactly were these habits?" West's face flushed slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Ah, nothing that needs to concern you, Poirot. You should be investigating the details of the death, not his lifestyle." Poirot's gaze did not falter. "But perhaps I should, monsieur. You see, I've heard whispers of financial difficulties. A lawsuit. A very public one, no less." For the briefest of moments, I saw West's jaw tighten. His hands shifted uncomfortably on the papers in front of him. Well, that's hardly relevant now, is it? The case is closed. Darcy's death wasn't suspicious." Poirot's voice was soft, but its implication was clear. "You are quick to dismiss the possibility of foul play, Monsieur West. That is as curious. A director of a company who has so much to lose would not be so quick to dismiss a tragedy that may be tied to financial ruin." There was an uncomfortable silence. West shifted again, his eyes darting away as though he were searching for a way to deflect the conversation. "I'm telling you, Poirot, this has nothing to do with money. It was an accident, plain and simple." Poirot was not finished, however. He studied West for a long moment, as if weighing his words. "We shall see, Monsieur West. We shall see." Our final interview that day was with Marjorie, the housemaid who had been with the company for many years. She was clearly nervous, her hands twisting together in a futile attempt to calm herself as she spoke. I didn't see anything, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing unusual, I swear. I went about my work as usual. The actors were rehearsing, and Mr. Darcy, well, he seemed the same as always. There was nothing odd about him, not really." Poirot's eyes were steady on her, his tone soft but piercing. "You are quite certain of this, mademoiselle? You saw nothing at all?" Marjorie's eyes flickered with unease. She looked down at her hands as if unwilling to meet his gaze. "No, monsieur. Nothing unusual, nothing strange." Poirot did not move for a long moment, his mind working through the contradictions he had just uncovered. Marjorie's reluctance was palpable, though she did her best to mask it. "I see," Poirot said slowly. "But I wonder, mademoiselle, if you might be hiding something." The words hung in the air, and I watched as Marjorie's face paled. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For just a moment I saw something in her eyes, fear, uncertainty, and something else, something that made my skin crawl. It was as though she knew more than she was willing to share. Poirot's gaze shifted from her to the room around us, as if already assembling the pieces of a puzzle in his mind. Something, he knew, was amiss. I, for one, was beginning to feel it too. With a slight nod to Marjorie, Poirot turned to me. "Let us leave her, mon ami. There is more to this than meets the eye." And so we departed the room. But as we did, I could feel the weight of the mystery settling in more heavily than before. The shadows of the stage were long, and I had the distinct sense that we were being led into them step by step. The following day, Poirot seemed to have become increasingly absorbed in the details of Darcy's dressing room. We had returned to the theatre under the pretense of further investigation, though the atmosphere had shifted slightly since our last visit. The stage, once lively with its actors and crew, now seemed almost desolate in its stillness, as though the death of its star had drained all energy from the place. I had expected Poirot to continue his interrogations with the remaining staff, but he had a different plan. He insisted on revisiting the scene of the death to sift through the personal effects of the actor. I was unsure what exactly he hoped to find, but I knew that when Poirot set his mind to something, no detail, no matter how insignificant it might seem, was beyond his scrutiny. We entered the small cluttered dressing room. The faint scent of old stage makeup still hung in the air, mixing with the musty odor of discarded costumes. There was a sense of abandonment to the space, as though it had been left untouched in the wake of the tragedy. On a nearby table lay a collection of personal items, a crumpled script, a half-drunk bottle of brandy, some scattered notes, and a few props, standard fare for an actor's dressing room. But Poirot did not pay these objects much attention. Instead, his sharp eyes scanned every corner, his gaze flitting over the smallest details. I watched him carefully, noting the way he inspected the room with precision, his movements deliberate, almost surgical in their focus. His little grey cells were clearly working, assembling pieces of a puzzle I could not yet see. And then, without warning, he stopped. I turned to follow his gaze. He was standing by the vanity mirror, one hand delicately lifting an object from the table. It was a pocket watch, old-fashioned, its brass casing worn with time. Poirot turned it over in his hands, his eyes narrowing. "Mon ami," he said softly, "look at this." I approached him, my curiosity piqued. The watch, though clearly aged, was intricately designed, with a delicate engraving on the back. "J.D.," it read. My first thought was of Julian Darcy, but there was something in the way Poirot held the watch, careful, as though he were considering the possibility that it did not belong to the actor at all. Who would have a watch such as this, I wonder? Poirot mused aloud, turning the watch over again, his eyes scanning it. "It is not Darcy's, I believe. No, this is someone else's possession." "But whose, Poirot?" I asked, my voice tinged with the same uncertainty that lingered in the air. "You don't think— Hastings, you have been quick to leap to conclusions," he interrupted, his tone light but pointed. "No, I do not think it belonged to Darcy. His watch, I suspect, was of a very different nature, more in line with the elegant, though simple tastes of a man who sought little to distract from his art." I nodded, though I was still puzzled. It was an odd thing to find in a dressing room, and its significance was lost on me for the moment. Poirot seemed lost in thought, running his fingers gently over the engraving once more. His expression was unreadable, but I knew he was deep in his calculations. He placed the watch back on the table with great care, as though he feared disturbing the faint trail it might leave behind. "I must inquire further," Poirot said quietly, turning toward the door. "There is much more to this mystery than a simple death." I followed him out of the room, my mind racing with questions. But there was something in the way he held himself, something different from his usual controlled demeanor. A new thread had been uncovered, and I knew that the watch would lead us somewhere, though I could not say where. The next few hours were spent in quiet reflection, each of us lost in our own thoughts as we awaited the next step. Poirot's demeanor was unchanged, but I could sense the flicker of something deeper behind his eyes. He had a sense of something just beyond our reach, something that he was still working to piece together. We had arranged to speak with some of the theatre staff again, this time those who had been closest to Darcy in his final days. But as we walked back through the empty halls of the theatre, I could not shake the feeling that something was about to shift. Our next stop was Lena Vernon, who had been less than forthcoming with information. Though Poirot had his suspicions about her cold detachment, he had not yet pressed her fully. I had a feeling that we would now begin to uncover more of what she was hiding. When we entered her dressing room, Lena looked up from a small script. She was reading. She greeted us with a tight smile, but the forced nature of it did nothing to ease the tension that had built between us since our last conversation. "I trust you found everything you were looking for?" she asked, her voice a touch too casual. Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped toward her, his gaze never leaving her face. "Mademoiselle Vernon, I believe there is something you have not yet told me." Her eyes flickered slightly, but she recovered quickly, raising an eyebrow. "I've told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot's voice remained calm, though there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You have spoken of Mr. Darcy's strange behavior, but you did not mention this watch that I found in his dressing room. It does not belong to him, I think." "No, it belongs to someone else entirely." Lena's face remained impassive, though I could see her hands twitching ever so slightly. "A watch? I don't know what you're talking about." "You lie," Poirot said, his tone quiet but forceful. "You know very well what I speak of. The watch is engraved with initials, J.D. Do they belong to you, mademoiselle?" She looked down, her expression hardening. For a brief moment, the facade cracked, revealing a flash of something: fear, anger. It was gone before I could fully identify it, but it was enough to confirm Poirot's suspicions. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. It was clear she was carefully weighing her response, and for a moment, the silence between us was thick with tension. Poirot waited patiently, his small hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable. I could see that he was allowing her time to make her decision. She was cornered, and I knew it would not be long before she would crack. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It belongs to someone. Someone I used to know. But that's all I'll say, Monsieur Poirot. I can't—" At that moment, she stopped herself as though realizing that she had already said too much. Poirot's eyes glittered with quiet triumph. "Ah, mademoiselle, you see, we are now getting to the heart of the matter, but I shall leave it to you to tell me more in time." As we left her dressing room, I could feel the weight of the mystery growing heavier with each step. The discovery of the watch, coupled with Lena's strange response, was shifting the case in unexpected directions. Darcy's death was no longer just an accident. It was a calculated performance, a tragedy wrapped in layers of secrecy, and with that, the curtain was slowly rising on the dark undercurrents that lay beneath the surface. The truth was still elusive, but Poirot's steady mind was beginning to unearth it, one piece at a time. A key had been found in the dark, and it was only a matter of time before it unlocked the mystery we had been chasing. The morning was damp, with an air of quiet anticipation as Poirot prepared for his second round of interviews. The tension in the theatre had only heightened since our last visit. Each of the people involved in Darcy's death carried with them their own unspoken truths, and I knew that we were about to uncover more of the hidden motives lurking just beneath the surface. Poirot had insisted we begin with Marjorie, the housemaid, who had been unusually hesitant in her previous statements. Her role in the household was seemingly menial, but Poirot, as always, understood that no one could be dismissed as insignificant. I was certain he had his suspicions, though what those suspicions were he had not yet shared with me. We found Marjorie in the kitchen, nervously preparing a tray of tea. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the cup on the table for Poirot, her eyes darting to the floor. She seemed ill at ease in his presence, though I couldn't blame her. Poirot's unrelenting gaze had a way of making anyone feel as though they were under a magnifying glass. "Please, mademoiselle, do not be nervous," Poirot said, his voice soft yet insistent. "You are simply assisting me with an investigation. Your cooperation is all that is required." Marjorie nodded, though she looked far from reassured. She stood by the window, casting furtive glances toward the door as though hoping someone might come to her rescue. Poirot, with his characteristic patience, waited for her to speak. I didn't see much," she stammered, her voice thin, with anxiety. "But I did see Mr. Darcy arguing with someone just before it happened." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Ah, an argument. Tell me, who was this person?" Marjorie hesitated. I don't know. I didn't get a good look at them. It was just a shadowy figure. I think it was a man, but I couldn't say for sure." "An argument, yes?" Poirot pressed, his voice low and compelling. "Was it heated? Did Mr. Darcy seem afraid?" Her face paled and she wrung her hands together. I think he was. He didn't shout, but there was something in his voice. I don't know what it was, but I could tell something wasn't right. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on her as though weighing her every word. And did this man, this shadowy figure, say anything to Mr. Darcy? Marjorie shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. No, I didn't hear anything. I just saw them standing in the hallway. I don't know what it was about, but it was unsettling. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, though I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Marjorie had given him nothing concrete, but her vague description of a confrontation, especially one involving a figure she couldn't identify, added another layer of uncertainty to the case. Well, mademoiselle, I thank you, Poirot said, standing up. You have been most helpful, though I believe there is more to this story yet to be revealed. As we left the kitchen, I could sense the weight of Poirot's thoughts. Marjorie's account had been cryptic at best, and the idea of a shadowy figure, a person who may or may not have been involved in Darcy's death, was unsettling. But Poirot had no doubt that this was a crucial piece in the puzzle. Someone had been lurking in the wings, and it was only a matter of time before they stepped forward into the light. Our next stop was Lena Vernon's dressing room. The actress had been strangely distant during our previous conversation, and Poirot had no intention of letting her deflect any longer. If Darcy had been afraid of something, if his death had been the result of something more than an accident, Lena was bound to know more. Lena was seated by her mirror when we entered, her face painted with the same calm that had marked her demeanor the previous day. Yet as Poirot approached her, I saw a slight change in her expression, an almost imperceptible shift that suggested she was bracing herself for what was to come. Mademoiselle Vernon, Poirot began, his voice quiet but commanding, you mentioned before that Mr. Darcy had been fearful in the days leading up to his death. You said he feared something, but you did not elaborate. What was it that troubled him so? Lena's eyes flickered briefly to the door, as though checking for any eavesdroppers, before her gaze returned to Poirot. She hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing her words. I can't say much about it, she replied softly. It was a personal matter. But yes, he was afraid. He kept to himself more than usual, and he seemed restless, as though he knew something was coming. Poirot was undeterred. Ah, but what was it? What was he afraid of, mademoiselle? Lena bit her lip, her fingers nervously toying with a strand of her hair. She faltered, then looked at Poirot with a mixture of defiance and regret. It's not something I can explain. He didn't trust anyone, especially Arthur. And there were things about the theatre, things he wasn't telling anyone. He was planning to leave. Leave? Poirot repeated, his interest piqued. Leave the theatre? You mean to say that Mr. Darcy intended to abandon his position in the company? Why? Lena's eyes clouded with something I could not quite place. He had his reasons, she said, her tone tight. But whatever they weren't just about the company. There was something else. I don't know exactly what it was, but he was trying to escape. Poirot seemed to be deep in thought, but he did not press her further. Instead, he gave her a small, reassuring smile. Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most cooperative. As we stepped out of her dressing room, I could sense the layers of secrecy building around this case. Darcy had been planning to leave the theatre, something that seemed tied to his growing fear. Lena's words suggested that the cause of his anxiety was not entirely personal, but perhaps professional. Our final interview was with Arthur West, the director, who had seemed eager to distance himself from the tragedy. As we entered his office, I could sense the tension in the room. Arthur sat behind his desk, his fingers drumming nervously on the wood. He gave us a tight-lipped smile, though it did little to disguise the tension in his posture. Monsieur West, Poirot began, you mentioned earlier that you were facing financial difficulties. I wonder, could Mr. Darcy's departure from the theatre have had anything to do with that? Arthur stiffened. What are you implying, Poirot? I imply nothing, Poirot said calmly. I am merely asking. It is well known that the success of the company depended heavily on Mr. Darcy's performances. If he were to leave, it would, how shall I put it, it would not bode well for your finances, non? Arthur's face flushed. Yes, well, Darcy's departure would have been a problem, but that's no reason to... He stopped himself abruptly, clearly realizing that he had let something slip. Poirot's eyes glinted with quiet understanding. "Ah, but Monsieur West, you are beginning to speak of things you would rather not. I suggest you proceed with caution. The truth has a way of coming to light." Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but did not respond further. We left his office in silence, the tension thick between us. The web of lies had grown more intricate with each passing moment, and each interview had added another layer to the mystery. Darcy's fear, Arthur's financial troubles, and Marjorie's cryptic observations had all pointed toward one undeniable truth. Someone had a strong motive for wanting him out of the picture. As we made our way back to the quiet confines of Poirot's study, I could feel the weight of the case bearing down on me. The puzzle pieces were starting to align, but I was still no closer to understanding who among them could have orchestrated such a death. Poirot, for his part, said nothing. He was thinking, watching, and waiting for something, one final piece to fall into place, and I had no doubt that when it did, the truth would be revealed. The atmosphere in the theatre seemed to thicken with each passing day. No longer a place of creative energy, it had become a den of suspicion, where every word spoken and every glance exchanged was laced with meaning. I had felt, for the first time, the true weight of the case upon my shoulders. It was not simply a murder. It was a web carefully woven with lies, secrets, and half-truths. I was beginning to see the strands unravel before my eyes, but the more I understood, the more complicated it became. We had just finished our interviews, and Poirot was unusually quiet as we sat together in his study, sipping the tea I had made for us. His expression was unreadable, and it seemed as if the great detective was lost in thought. It was then that the door opened, and a man entered without so much as a knock. His presence struck me immediately as unwelcome, almost invasive. He was tall, with an air of quiet arrogance, his dark hair neatly combed, and his tailored suit giving him the look of someone who frequented fashionable London establishments. But it wasn't his appearance that caught my attention. It was his eyes that gleamed with an odd mix of pride and calculation. "Ah, Monsieur Waverley," Poirot said, his voice smooth, but there was a certain edge to it. "We were not expecting you. Richard Waverley, I learned, was an old lover of Lena Vernon's, a fact he did not hesitate to announce. He claimed to have known Darcy well, and his manner was, if anything, dramatic. There was an exaggerated quality to his speech, as though he were performing on stage rather than speaking with us. I had to come, of course," Waverley said with a flourish, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I knew Mr. Darcy, dearly in fact, and I must tell you, Poirot, there was much more to him than anyone realized. He was planning to make a very public revelation, something that would have shocked you all." I exchanged a glance with Poirot, who had been carefully observing Waverley from his armchair. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could sense his suspicion brewing. "A revelation, you say?" Poirot replied, his voice calm but laced with interest. "And what was this revelation, Monsieur Waverley? Something of great importance, I presume?" Waverley smiled, but there was something too practiced about it, too rehearsed. "Ah, my dear Poirot, I cannot possibly say, but I can tell you it was something he had been working on for months. He had planned to announce it publicly, and it would have changed everything." The theatricality in his words only made me more skeptical. There was no substance to his statements, just an air of mystery and a hint of drama. What was he trying to achieve by making these insinuations? "Why now?" Poirot asked, his gaze unwavering. "Why do you come to us with this information now after Mr. Darcy's death?" Waverley's expression shifted slightly, but he quickly regained his composure. "Well, Poirot, I didn't know. The man was in danger. If I had, I would have acted sooner. But now with him gone, I felt it was important to make this known, to show that his death was not just an accident." Poirot took a slow sip of his tea, considering the words carefully. "Ah, Monsieur Waverley, it is most convenient, is it not? You have knowledge of something secret, but you cannot reveal it. How very dramatic." Waverley stiffened at the implied criticism, but Poirot's tone remained polite, almost teasing. "You are suggesting, Monsieur Waverley, that Darcy's death was no accident?" "That it was planned?" I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Waverley hesitated, then nodded, his eyes glittering with a mix of uncertainty and resolve. "Yes, that is what I believe. It was no accident. There was something very dark happening in that theatre." Poirot, never one to let a dramatic flourish slide by, regarded him with a raised eyebrow. "And yet, you have no proof, Monsieur Waverley. Merely a suspicion, no?" Waverley's eyes flickered momentarily, and I could see the tension in his jaw. But then he smiled again, this time more thinly. "Perhaps, Poirot, but you'll find the truth eventually. It always comes out, doesn't it?" With that he turned and left as abruptly as he had come, leaving a strange, heavy silence in his wake. Poirot's eyes followed him out of the room, and I could sense that the mystery had just deepened. What was Waverley's true motive in making such claims? Was he merely stirring the pot, or did he know something more than he was letting on? "Poirot, do you believe him?" I asked once. The door had closed behind Waverley. Poirot sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "Monsieur Waverley is a man of many words, Hastings, but words do not make a truth, they make an illusion." I nodded, unsure of what to make of the cryptic response. Poirot always seemed to have a sense of when someone was hiding something, but in this case the truth seemed as elusive as smoke. It was at that moment that I noticed something I had failed to see before. Lena had come into the room while Waverley was speaking, and she had not said a word, but I couldn't help but notice the glint of something on her wrist, a piece of jewelry, a brooch, to be precise, that did not belong to her. It was a small, delicate thing, shaped like a rose, but its design was entirely unfamiliar to me. I had spent enough time around Lena to know she did not wear such pieces. Her style was simpler, more understated. This was something different, something out of place. "Lena," I said, my voice steady but curious, "where did you get that?" She looked at me, startled for a brief moment before her expression smoothed over, and she casually removed the brooch from her wrist. "Oh, it's nothing," she replied, her voice too light, too dismissive. "Just a little trinket someone gave me." Poirot's gaze flickered to the brooch before returning to Lena, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "A gift, you say? Who gave it to you, mademoiselle?" Lena paused, then smiled weakly. "I'm afraid I don't remember. It was just a little gift," but the way she clutched it, almost protectively, told me that there was more to the story. That brooch was important. Its connection to Darcy, or to something hidden in the theatre, was now a question that lingered in my mind. Was this an item Darcy had left behind? Had it been given to her by someone else? And why was she so intent on downplaying it? Poirot said nothing, but I could see that his mind was already racing. As we parted from Lena's room, I felt the weight of the mystery growing heavier by the moment. Richard Waverley's sudden appearance had introduced a new thread of confusion, while Lena's seemingly trivial jewelry raised more questions than answers. The puzzle was shifting once again, and the pieces were now scattered in directions I hadn't anticipated. As always, Poirot remained the master of illusion, patiently waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. But I knew, whatever the case may be, the answers were getting closer, and someone's carefully constructed mask was about to slip. The days were stretching into a tense quiet, the kind of silence that only seems to echo in places where guilt and suspicion run deep. The theatre, once a place of laughter and applause, now felt heavy with secrets, as if each corner held the shadows of things unspoken. Every step I took through its hallways, I couldn't shake the sense that the truth was both tantalizingly close and frustratingly out of reach. Poirot, as always, was unflappable, his expression a perfect mask of composure, but I could tell by the sharpness of his gaze that he was closing in on something, and yet the puzzle remained as intricate as ever. I had been with Poirot in the study when the news came, carried by a quiet knock at the door. A letter, an anonymous tip. It had been sent under mysterious circumstances, and as Poirot opened it, his expression hardened. He glanced at me briefly before unfolding the contents with his characteristic care. A name, Arthur West. I frowned. Arthur West was the owner of the theatre, but what did he have to do with any of this? Poirot's lips parted slightly, his eyes flickering with what I could only describe as cautious intrigue. "Monsieur West," he murmured, "has been hiding something, Hastings. It seems that his identity is not as straightforward as we believed." My heart skipped a beat. I had always felt there was something off about West, but to think that his name was a false one, that was something else entirely. Poirot's mind worked quickly. A criminal past, Hastings. A prior conviction. Under a different name. Arthur West is not who he claims to be. The weight of his words settled like a stone in my chest. Was it possible? Had Darcy's murder been a result of something as sordid as blackmail or worse, a personal vendetta tied to Arthur's hidden life? It was the first real fracture in the carefully constructed facade of the suspects we had been considering. I felt an uneasy stirring, the kind of feeling one gets when a mask slips just long enough to reveal a face you weren't expecting. Poirot had already begun making plans. His sharp deductions had taken on a new urgency. He had no intention of letting this revelation slip by. As if to confirm his intentions, he turned to me with his usual calm. "We will speak with Monsieur West, but first, there is another matter, Hastings." I followed Poirot into the small drawing room where Lena had been waiting, her demeanor slightly off, more closed off than usual. She was sitting at the window, her hands folded in her lap, but she rose as we entered, her expression softening. When she saw Poirot, "Poirot," she said, her voice tentative, I need to speak with you." It was unlike Lena to seek out a private conversation so openly, especially after all that had happened. She was a woman who held her cards close, and I knew Poirot had been watching her carefully, his suspicions lingering over her every word and action. It was now clear why. Lena's confession came slowly, each word carefully measured, as if she feared the consequences of what she was about to reveal. I was married to Darcy's brother, James," she said, her eyes avoiding mine. "We were young. It didn't last long, but Darcy never forgave me for it." I blinked, struggling to process the weight of her words. Darcy's brother, an enigmatic figure, at least to us, had always been a shadow in the background, a name rarely mentioned in any of our conversations. That Lena had been married to him, and that Darcy had never forgiven her, cast a sudden and unsettling light on their relationship. What had happened between them? Was this the source of the deep-seated tension that had seemed to pervade their interactions? "Forgive me, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently, though his voice was edged with an unmistakable curiosity. "But why did you not share this before?" Lena hesitated, her lips trembling slightly. She took a breath, and when she spoke again, her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. Because I wasn't sure who I could trust. I thought perhaps it didn't matter anymore. But now, I see how wrong I was. Darcy's death, it brought all of this back. The emotional weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, and I could sense that Lena was unraveling in a way that mirrored the case itself. The tension was growing thicker, the complexities more entangled. But the real question now was, how did this new piece of information fit into the larger puzzle? Did Darcy's brother have a role in this? Had Lena's past with him somehow influenced the events leading up to Darcy's death? Before I could voice the questions swirling in my mind, Poirot spoke again, his voice soft but purposeful. "Mademoiselle, you are a woman of many secrets. It seems there is much that we do not know about your past. And yet, I must ask, do you believe that your history with Mr. Darcy's brother could be a motive for his death?" Lena's face tightened, her hands clenching into fists. "No," she said, a flicker of defensiveness in her voice. "But it could have played a part in something Darcy was planning." Poirot's gaze was sharp. "Something he was planning, you say? Could this be the revelation Monsieur Waverley spoke of? Was Darcy planning to expose something about his brother? Or perhaps you?" Lena flinched at the suggestion, her face pale. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I only know that Darcy was a man who couldn't forget. He carried grudges like a man carries a heavy load, and when it got too much for him, it consumed him." As the silence stretched between us, I couldn't help but feel the gravity of Lena's words. There was so much more to this story than I had imagined. Darcy's personal life, his family, his past, was as tangled as the lies that surrounded his death. Poirot remained still, his expression unreadable, but I could see the shifting patterns in his mind. Pieces were clicking into place, though the full picture still eluded him, as it did me. Arthur West's hidden past, Lena's confession, the strange events leading up to Darcy's murder. It was all beginning to coalesce into something far more complicated than I had anticipated. "We will need to speak with Mr. West," Poirot said, breaking the silence. "I suspect we will find more than we expect." I nodded, my own thoughts racing. Whatever secrets Arthur West had been hiding, whatever dark truths lay behind Lena's past, I knew that we were closer now to the heart of this mystery. But as the pieces fell into place, I could feel the atmosphere tightening. Someone was getting desperate, and the truth was slipping dangerously close to the surface. I had the sense that very soon the mask would slip entirely. But who would it be? The atmosphere at the theatre had shifted. Subtly at first, but with each passing hour the tension had grown palpable, suffocating the once vibrant space with a sense of dread. Poirot had become a shadow in the hallways, his eyes scanning every face, every subtle gesture. As for the rest of us, we were trapped in a web of suspicion, each movement watched, each word weighed. The puzzle of Darcy's death had deepened, and the pieces seemed to slip further out of our grasp, no matter how hard we tried to hold on. I had expected Poirot to be on the brink of some revelation, but it was clear now that the mystery was only becoming more complicated. The revelations of Arthur West's hidden past and Lena's turbulent history with Darcy had set off ripples in the investigation, but nothing had come close to shaking the walls of the truth like the disappearance. So of Marjorie. The morning had been quiet enough when we noticed her absence. A sense of unease settled over the staff as we went about our duties. She had been there one moment, a soft murmur of footsteps in the hallways, a rustle of her uniform, and then gone the next. At first, we thought nothing of it. Perhaps she had simply slipped away for some brief respite. But as the hours dragged on without any word from her, suspicion began to creep into the edges of our thoughts. By afternoon, Poirot's demeanor had shifted. His mind was working, sifting through possibilities with that same quiet intensity I had come to recognize. When we found Marjorie's room, it was a scene of hasty departure, clothes strewn about, a bed unmade, and nothing in the way of an explanation. The one thing that stood out, however, was the letter. Poirot, ever methodical, picked it up with a careful hand. The envelope, slightly crumpled, was addressed to no one specifically, though the handwriting was unmistakable. Darcy's. My breath caught in my chest. Darcy had written this, and to whom? Poirot carefully opened the letter, his eyes scanning the words with a practiced speed. He did not read aloud, but his face darkened as he finished. I saw him take a deep breath before folding the letter back into its envelope with a precise motion. "Mon ami," Poirot said, turning to me with a glance that was almost weary. "It seems we have another thread to follow. A letter addressed to someone named F. But who is this F? And why would Darcy write such a letter, especially given the circumstances of his death?" I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. The mystery of this letter and Marjorie's disappearance. Why had she taken it with her? What had she known that had made her flee? But more than that, I couldn't help but wonder if this new clue was leading us towards someone we hadn't yet considered. As if summoned by the rising tension, Lena appeared at the door. Her face, usually so composed, was drawn and pale. She looked out of place here, like a character in a play who had forgotten their lines. "Poirot," she said, her voice trembling, "they're questioning me. The police, they think I know more than I'm telling them. They know about my past with Darcy's brother, and they're pressing me to explain everything. What do I do?" Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and he regarded her for a long moment. "Mademoiselle," he said, his tone calm, but there was an underlying sharpness. "Perhaps you should tell them everything, but tell them also that you are under no obligation to reveal your every thought, your every action. You are innocent until proven otherwise." Lena's lip quivered, and I could see the strain in her posture. Her anxiety had grown, no longer controlled or composed. "I can't—" She stopped herself, swallowing hard. "I can't do this anymore. It's all too much. I'm not—" She broke off, her face flushing with a mixture of panic and guilt. I had never seen her like this before. The cool, enigmatic woman had cracked, and the strain of the situation was starting to overwhelm her. My first instinct was to go to her, but Poirot held up a hand, signaling for me to stay put. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, "you must try to compose yourself. We must remain focused on the facts." Lena nodded, but it was clear she was struggling. Her breaths were shallow, her hands trembling. As she turned to leave, I watched her go, and for the first time in this whole investigation, I wondered if the woman I had thought to be one of the most composed of the lot was actually harboring something far deeper, something darker. With Lena gone, Poirot and I stood in the room for a moment, the silence between us heavy. The letter in his hand seemed to burn with questions, F being the largest of them all. Poirot was already turning his thoughts over. "I suspect Marjorie's disappearance and the letter are not mere coincidences. Whoever this F is, they are important enough for Darcy to have written them a letter, hidden it in a place that Marjorie could have easily found. It seems rather deliberate, does it not, Hastings?" I agreed, my mind working to connect the dots. Marjorie had always been quiet, reserved, but she had also been close to the action. She would have had access to Darcy's personal items, and if she had uncovered something, or perhaps even been involved with this F, it would explain why she had disappeared. But the question was, why had she left? And why take the letter? Poirot tapped his fingers lightly on the edge of the desk, his eyes unfocused as though he were thinking aloud. "We must find Marjorie," he said after a moment, "but more than that, we must uncover the identity of this F. Only then will we have our answer." At that moment, the door to the room creaked open again and Arthur West entered. His face was tense, his usual self-assured demeanor absent. His eyes flicked nervously between Poirot and me. I need to speak to you both," he said, his voice hoarse. "This business with Marjorie, it's become too much. I'm afraid things are spiraling out of control. You must understand I'm not the one you're looking for." Poirot didn't immediately respond. He simply stared at West, his gaze unblinking and unyielding. And for a moment the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. "I am not." "So sure, Monsieur West," Poirot said quietly, but his voice carried an edge that suggested he was far from convinced. Arthur's eyes widened, and his mouth tightened in frustration. "I have nothing to do with this, nothing at all. But you're all looking at me as if I were guilty of something." Poirot did not flinch. "Perhaps," he said softly. "But you see, Monsieur West, it is always the ones who protest the loudest. That one must examine the closest." Arthur's face went white, but before he could reply there was a sudden knock on the door. "Poirot," the voice on the other side called urgently, "it's the police. They need to speak with you about Marjorie's disappearance." As the door swung open, I felt the air grow colder, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The net was tightening, and soon someone would slip. The tension in the theatre that morning was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the subtle rustling of papers, every sound seemed amplified in the oppressive silence that filled the room. Poirot had gathered the key players of the investigation in one place, and the air was thick with anticipation. Every single person in the room knew that the moment of revelation was at hand, and each of us felt the weight of suspicion settling heavily on our shoulders. I stood by Poirot, observing him as he stood with quiet confidence, at the center of the room. His usual calm demeanor was as unshakable as ever, but I could sense that he was, as always, calculating every movement, every word. He turned to face the group, his small eyes scanning each person carefully, as though they were mere chess pieces, in a game that had reached its final, most critical move. "The case, mes amis, is now clear," Poirot said, his voice calm yet carrying an undeniable authority. "And I will explain to you all how it was that Monsieur Darcy met his untimely death." He held up a small ornate pocket watch in his hand. It had seemed insignificant at first, just a small, classic timepiece that any man might own. But now, in the context of everything that had transpired, it was the key to unlocking the whole mystery. The watch had been found at the scene of the crime, clutched in Darcy's hand as though it had been an object of great importance. Poirot's eyes flicked to Arthur West, who was standing near the back of the room. "It is a curious thing," Poirot continued, "to find such an item in the possession of the victim, no? A pocket watch that, upon further investigation, has a most intriguing history." Arthur stiffened, his gaze darting nervously around the room. He had been growing more agitated over the past few hours, and now it seemed as though he was almost bracing himself for something. I could see him struggling to maintain his composure, but it was clear that Poirot's words had shaken him. "This watch," Poirot continued, "once belonged to Monsieur Darcy's late brother, Julian Darcy. Julian, as you all know, passed away several years ago under mysterious circumstances." He paused, letting the weight of this revelation hang in the air. "And it is not a coincidence that this same pocket watch would resurface after all this time. No, mes amis. This watch was not simply a cherished family heirloom. It was, in fact, a symbol of something far darker." There was a slight gasp from Lena, who had been standing quietly by the window, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her face remained unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a flash of guilt or perhaps recognition. Poirot's gaze flicked to her, though he did not address her directly. "You see," he continued, "Julian Darcy's death was not an accident. It was, in fact, part of a larger, far more twisted scheme, a scheme that involved not only the late Julian, but also the very man standing in this room with us today." Arthur West took a half-step forward, his face paling. "What are you implying, Poirot?" His voice trembled, though he tried to mask it with bravado. Poirot's voice softened, but his eyes were unwavering. "I am implying, Monsieur West, that you are not who you claim to be. You are not simply the cousin of the late Julian Darcy, but rather his twin brother. You, Arthur West, are the rightful heir to the Darcy estate, an estate that your brother never intended to leave you." The room fell deathly silent. Even Lena, who had been fidgeting nervously, froze in place, her eyes locked on Poirot in disbelief. Arthur's face had drained of colour, and he stumbled backward as though the accusation had physically struck him. "You see, Monsieur West, your true identity was hidden for years," Poirot went on, his voice cool and composed. "When Julian Darcy died, it was not an accidental death, as most assumed. He was murdered by you. You had hoped that, once he was gone, you could step into his life and inherit the fortune that should have been yours. But that was not to be, for despite your elaborate plan, Darcy's will stated clearly that his fortune would go to someone else." Arthur's hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white with the effort to control his emotions. "No," he spat. "That's not true. You're lying," Poirot continued unfazed. "You were determined to get what you felt was rightfully yours. And so when Darcy returned to the theatre, you saw your opportunity. But not just to murder him. You wanted to make it look like an accident to cover your tracks. You knew that the pocket watch, which had been left behind by your brother, would be a perfect clue to suggest a robbery gone wrong. But you did not. Count on one thing, the keen mind of Hercule Poirot." Arthur stood motionless, his lips trembling, as if he were trying to form words but failing. It was as though he knew the jig was up. Poirot stepped closer to him, his small, intense eyes never leaving Arthur's face. "And then, of course, we have the matter of the letter, Darcy's final communication to someone named F. I believe that letter was meant for you, Monsieur West. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the final nail in the coffin of your plan. But you made one grave mistake, one fatal mistake." Poirot's gaze flicked to Lena, who was now looking down at the floor, her face filled with a mix of sorrow and shame. "You underestimated the effect that your actions would have on others, particularly on Mademoiselle Lena." Lena's breath caught in her throat and she finally spoke, her voice trembling. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to tell you all. I had no choice." Her words trailed off as she sank into a chair, overcome with emotion. Poirot turned to her, his voice softer but no less firm. "You, mademoiselle, were the beneficiary of Darcy's will, though he had no intention of ever making good on it. The guilt of your past, of your relationship with Julian, weighed on you. And when you discovered that Arthur had been hiding his true identity, you knew what he had done, but you kept the secret, didn't you? You hoped that by keeping quiet, you could preserve what was left of your own life, your own dignity. Lena's face twisted with guilt, but there was no denying the truth in Poirot's words. The weight of it all was too much to bear. Poirot turned, back to Arthur. You killed your brother not just for money, but for revenge. And when you thought you had covered your tracks, you returned here to claim what you believed to be yours. But your plan was undone by the very people you thought you had fooled. Arthur was trembling now, his eyes wide with terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot turned toward the group, his voice strong as he made the final pronouncement. And so it is clear. The murderer of Julian Darcy is none other than Arthur West, his twin brother, hidden for years behind a false identity, driven by greed, anger, and a desire to claim what he had never been given. The room fell into stunned silence. For a long moment no one moved. Arthur's world had crumbled, and in that silence it seemed as though everything had fallen into place. Poirot's eyes were calm and resolute as he gave his final assessment. There is no more need for doubt. The case is solved, and with that the theatre that had once been a stage for deception and drama became the scene of its final act. The truth revealed, the mystery unravelled. The arrest of Arthur West was a quiet affair, with little of the drama one might expect after such a tense revelation. He offered no resistance, nor any final plea for mercy. Instead, he stood motionless, his face drawn and pale, as if he had been expecting this moment all along, though perhaps not with the clarity and inevitability that Poirot had provided. The truth, once uncovered, left no room for further denial. The theatre company, once a close-knit group bound by shared ambition and trust, now moved about in a state of stunned disbelief. The fragile web of relationships that had held them together spun. From lies, envy, and concealed motives now lay in tatters. Marjorie, whose absence had marked the turning point in the investigation, was quietly dismissed from her post, though her role in the affair was one of naive complicity rather than active malice. Lena, on the other hand, faced the harsh reality of her involvement. Her love for Julian and the convoluted emotions surrounding her past with him had ultimately led her down a path of silence. Yet in her guilt-ridden confession, there was no desire for absolution, only a sorrowful recognition of her own failings. It was late in the evening before Poirot and I finally found ourselves alone in his study, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The case was, in his words, done, and yet the lingering thoughts on the human nature behind the crime filled the air between us, unspoken. Poirot sat in his customary chair, his fingers steepled, his expression contemplative. He said nothing for a long time, and I too found myself unable to break the silence. It seemed that even after all the revelations, there was a lingering sense of unsettledness, an unshakable understanding that the truth, while revealed, had exposed more than just the culprit. Finally, Poirot spoke, his voice calm, yet laced, with an underlying gravity. "Hastings, you have witnessed the course of this investigation, n'est-ce pas? You have seen how the truth, so carefully hidden behind the most delicate of masks, always finds its way to the light." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "Yes, Poirot, but I wonder, why do people do such things? Why go to such lengths to deceive, to hide?" Poirot's gaze turned inward for a moment, as though he were contemplating a deeper question than the case itself. "You see, mon ami," he said slowly, "the human heart is a curious thing. It yearns for what it cannot have, or it seeks to shield itself from a truth that might be unbearable. In the case of Arthur West, it was not only greed that drove him, but a bitter desire to erase the past, to bury the truth of his identity, to mask it behind lies, until it became impossible for anyone, least of all himself, to discern what was real." I sat back in my chair, allowing his words to settle. The psychological depth of the case had never been lost on Poirot. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface of the mundane and the obvious. Even as he had pieced together the facts, he had been aware of the undercurrents, the motivations and fears that drove each person involved. But now, as the investigation had come to a close, it felt as though the true complexity of the crime had been only partially exposed. "What about Lena?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Was she truly an innocent bystander, or did she have more to hide than she let on? Poirot's gaze softened, and for a brief moment I saw a flicker of understanding pass between us. "Mademoiselle, Lena was not without her own guilt, that is certain. She had her own reasons for remaining silent. Her love for Julian Darcy, her past and the weight of a secret she could not share, these were powerful forces that shaped her actions. But in the end, Hastings, she was not the one who committed murder. She was, instead, a woman caught between her past and her present, unsure of how to reconcile the two." There was a quiet stillness in the room as Poirot leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he continued. "But it is always the same, is it not? We wear masks, each of us, thinking that they will protect us. We hide our flaws, our fears, our desires behind these facades, and we think no one will see through them. And yet in the end it is the truth that always prevails. It cannot be avoided. It will find its way into the light, sooner or later." I thought back on the events that had unfolded, and the words seemed to resonate deeply within me. There had been so many moments when the truth had been within reach, and yet it had been obscured by the fear of what might come from revealing it. Arthur had hidden behind the identity of a man long dead. Lena had concealed her painful past, and the others had all kept their secrets, believing they could protect themselves from the consequences of their actions. But in the end, Poirot's methodical approach had peeled away each layer, exposing the hidden motives behind the crime. "Poirot," I said after a pause, my voice filled with admiration, "you always manage to see things that others cannot. Even when the truth seems so far out of reach, you find it." Poirot gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It is not, my friend, a matter of seeing what others cannot. It is a matter of understanding that which is before you. The truth is always present in the smallest of details, in the most subtle of clues. You need only have the patience to look closely." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. In some ways, I felt as though the case had unraveled not just a mystery, but a deeper understanding of the human condition itself. The masks we wear, the roles we play, the secrets we keep, all of it is part of the performance we put on for the world. But, as Poirot had shown once again, no performance can last forever. As I rose to leave, Poirot's voice stopped me. "Hastings," he said softly, "do you know why I enjoy solving these cases?" I turned to him, intrigued. "Why is that, Poirot?" "Because," he said, his eyes gleaming with that characteristic sharpness, "in every crime there is the same question. What is the price of truth? And I believe, mon ami, that the truth is always worth the price, even when it reveals the darkness that lies behind the brightest of performances." And with that, Poirot returned to his chair, his thoughts already turning to the next puzzle, while I stood for a moment longer, contemplating the profound weight of his words. The truth, after all, was a powerful thing, and in this case, it had set things right, even as it had revealed the deeper complexities of the human heart. The curtain had closed on yet another mystery,